Ladies and gentlemen, coming up in just a moment, Bob Greaves, the Unconventional pastor, talks to you about early church history.
Say I'll see you.
Was some of the details that surround the beginnings of Christianity as a movement. We sometimes refer to it as early church history, and I sometimes refer to it that way myself, and other times I prefer not to because I really think that the word church is a word that is difficult to get people to understand how confusing it really can be. You know, in some ways, Christianity, as I see it, is a movement that is kind of sad in that it has lost its way. It's missed its calling, as it were. It started out as something that had some real promises. It has continued on without necessarily always being, I'm not saying it's just always a bad thing. It really isn't. There are many wonderful, wonderful things that the Christian movement has brought to us. And when I talk about the Christian movement and Christianity, I'm not always really talking about the same thing either. I mean, those of you who know me know that I'm a professing Christian. I say that, I believe in Jesus. I believe in, I expect to understand that the experience that I have is one of knowing the presence of God, and so in some ways that may seem confusing when I start talking about Christianity and its problems and the church and things that I have difficulty with. And I wish I had clearer language to use, but in our language here that we use, English, I'm kind of stuck with the language we got and the problems that it has. You see, I really, as you may have heard me say before, I really believe that when Jesus came, he came to do away with many of the religious issues that were going on. He came to displace religion with something other than religion. But he had no sooner, moved along, and we go back to rebuilding some of the authority that came and how popular he was becoming in various ways into another religious system that's merely in some ways technically different from other religious systems, but still just as religious and still possessing some of the same problems that all religious systems can have, that Jesus came to get away from. So now, today, we have a very popular worldwide religion that stands for many of the things that Jesus actually came to do away with. And that seems strange. Among those things that he came to do away with is the notion that we would have that we have to work through some sort of a hierarchy, that we have to be part of some sort of a community that has authority over us, between us and God. And Jesus came to give us the message that the kingdom of heaven is among you. You don't have to go through anybody to be in touch with the kingdom of heaven. That heaven, as it were, that God is someone you can be in touch with just yourself. That you are there in the presence of God all the time anyway. And that nothing needs to be done to get you special audience. Nothing needs to be done to make that relationship any better. That there it is. It's just there and in the raw. But one of the problems with that kind of a belief system is that and I say that somewhat facetiously, is that it's a bit vague. And sometimes people don't like vague. We don't like vague because it's hard to defend, it's hard to articulate, it's hard to talk about, and to still sound intelligent or with it. We also don't like vague for reasons that are not really all that awesome. We don't like vague because it's hard to control people with vague ideas. And religion is a huge way to control people. And so, what are we going to do with this Christian movement, this Messiah, this person who came and just turned everything around? For many of these people, was murdered and then is raised from the dead. And these phenomenal things are going on, and many people are being gathered to what's going on and accepting this freedom and this presence. And then it becomes a large movement. It starts having problems, needs to start to manage affairs and issues. It needs to start passing out groceries to widows and disabled people. It needs to start doing a lot of other things. And as it has to get organized, it jumps in real deep. So that I see Western history and the history of the church as being really a history of the falling apart of Christianity from its natural original habitat, which was that originally Christianity was supposed to be a kingdom that was here among us, within us, around us, but not a part of this physical material world. And there's no hierarchy here on earth. There's no organization here on earth. There's nothing here on earth other than the presence of God in us that is to be a part of this ongoing freedom. But we take all that freedom away. We create and build up an organization. Now, it's difficult sometimes to criticize that because I believe in organizations. I believe in being organized, and I don't have any problem with us having Christian organizations. I was trying to even express this the other day with another show and another guest, that it's not so much that the church is an organization that bothers me. It's that it's an organization that thinks it is founded as an organization by Jesus himself. And that causes the organization, and you can't run an organization without leadership, without some sort of a sense of charter, a sense of purpose, a sense of vision, some sort of way of controlling what identifies the organization in some cultural way. You just can't have an organization without that. How do you do that and still sustain the fact that the church is immaterial? It is, that its authority isn't here. That it just isn't a phenomenon that is physically, as it were, present on earth. Makes it difficult, but they managed to find a way of doing it. And today we have not only the Roman Catholic Church, which was the original organization as it developed into a solid organization by about by about the year 400, and then we have Protestant churches, and we've got various different other organizations that have split off from that, whether you're talking about Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or Christian Science, or a whole wide variety of different organizations that have split off from mainstream Christianity. All of these organizations claiming as organizations to represent God, to represent the truth as organizations, which is, in my opinion, kind of crazy. But anyhow, I want to take a look back at it. And part of what made me think about it, talking about it tonight, was, as you may have heard, we have a new pope. And on what makes that particularly interesting tonight is that this is the first time that we've ever had somebody declared to be pope of the Catholic Church who comes from the Americas, who comes from this hemisphere, and all South America, not North America. I do think that does definitely shows some things changing and moving over there in the Vatican. The current pope, he's going to be called Pope Francis. I think it's the first time we've had a pope by that name, and he's he's still a Jesuit, but he's going to be bringing some different directions, no doubt, to the Catholic organization. But that causes many people to understand that the Catholic organization is this huge, very, very powerful, very influential organization here on the planet. Now, when we take a look back, Catholicism really claims to be the original church, the original organization started by Jesus himself. Now, many Catholics differ in terms of how they say that. They also differ in what they mean by that. There are some Catholics who think of themselves as the original, but that, hey, they messed up, and so people have splintered off and gone in their own ways. And, well, that's the way that goes, and it's okay. And so there's some Catholics who, although they would believe themselves to be part of the original church, they don't see themselves as the only church that's around these days. There are other Catholics who believe that the Roman Catholic Church is the only church. It was the original church, and if you're not in it, you're outside of the good graces of God. You have to be a part of this organization. There would even be some so strong in that belief that they would feel that anybody who's not a part of the organization is seriously in danger of hell. And some would even go so far as to say that it's not a risk. You're going to hell. You're not part of the Catholic Church. Now, when you look back at this history, you wonder, how could an organization ever become an organization that really believes that it is the organization to represent Almighty God here on earth for everybody? How can an organization ever get to that point? That's pretty amazing. Of course, they claim that Peter was the first pope, and they base this on Peter's confession. There's a place in Jesus' ministry, late in his ministry, I might add, where he says, "So who do these people out there say that I am?" And they told me, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're some other prophet. A lot of people aren't sure who you are," and things like that. And then Jesus adds another question by saying, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter blurts it right out. Now, the interesting thing about this question, at least that I find very interesting, is this. Jesus has already been with his disciples for almost 3 years at this time, before he even asked them a question. And of course, we see Jesus' temptation at the beginning of his ministry, where he's tempted, if you are the Son of God, command these stones be made bread. If you are the Son of God, then jump from the highest part of the temple here. If you're the Son of God, bow down to me, and I'll give you all the kingdom of the earth, and all that stuff. A lot of people may miss the fact that part of a major theme in those temptations is, if you are the Son of God. And so Jesus' basic temptation is a temptation to prove who he is. But Jesus' ministry was not about proving who he was. It was about being who he was. It was about coming to do things that needed to be done. And who he is was not supposed to even be the issue. And so it wasn't. And here we find Jesus has been, in this ministry with his disciples and going about doing various different things, getting some people upset and getting a lot of people happy. And he says to his disciples, "So who do you say that I am?" And so this question is really late on, indicating that it really wasn't the issue that Jesus was dealing with, but he's curious as to where are they at with this now. Do they see? Is it there? And so then Peter blurts out, "You're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God." And Jesus tells Peter that it's on that rock that he's going to build his church. Now, because the name Peter, little rock, little stone, Cephas, or Peter, rock and all that, a lot of people think that Jesus is making Peter this rock upon which he will found his church. Jesus is really getting a little punny, and it's interesting that Peter, who has the name Cephas, in fact, Jesus renames Peter to Peter from Cephas because it was in some ways, I think, a way of building him up. What's your name? "Oh, I'm Cephas," and it kind of means I'm a little stone. And Jesus said, no, "You're a rock. You're a rock." And so he gets a new name, it's a way of Jesus encouraging. But it's interesting that this fellow who's a rock is the one who comes out and blurts out this confession. But Jesus is actually calling the confession the rock, not Peter, the confession. And you can tell that just if you can read Greek, it's I think it's as plain as day. I'm not going to start teaching all kinds of Greek here, but it's the confession that is the rock that Jesus is speaking about. And the church was built on this rock. The people who are wondering, who is this Jesus? And in examining the way he behaved, the way he lived, the things that he said, the people he touched, and they come to this conclusion. He's the Christ. He's the anointed one. He's the Christ. He's the Son of the living God. This is what the church is founded on. This is the rock that it's set upon. That's the rock right there. That confession, that recognition, that realization, that moment of clarity where you understand who Jesus is. Now, Peter had that moment. He's the first one we see in Scripture to actually declare that clearly. But it's amazing that we do have this, Peter making this confession, and we do have Jesus saying, "Wow, it's impressive. The flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but this is the rock." There's nothing in this discussion at all that Jesus and Peter had that says anything about, and I made this hat for you, and we'll call you Pope, and I want you to be wearing robes, and I want you to take authority and sit down, and I want you to be the executive of the church. There's no discussion of that sort going on at all. Not only there's no discussion about that in this context, there's no discussion about, and when you die, there will be a successor. You will see to it is appointed, and that will continue on. Now, originally, the church was under the impression that Jesus was coming right back. The apostles didn't think during their early ministry that they were going to need to be replaced. Nobody was even preparing to do that. In fact, the fact that the church wasn't even preparing to linger on longer than a generation is part of what caused many of the early problems in the church to occur. And this power struggle began because nobody was prepared to take on leadership of a movement that was evidently going to linger on for longer than just one generation. And so the problems began. But anyway, in this Peter's confession and his discussion with Jesus, there's just no talk about any of that stuff. As far as the Catholic Church is concerned, Pentecost was the day that the church began its public institution. As a public institution, it became a public institution, and some Catholics will actually teach that it was the public institution that was founded there on Pentecost. And in a sense, that's justifying even itself as an institution, as an organization, as some movement on earth that has actual people in offices, taking care of various different questions of leadership and maintaining that organization. Now, further legitimacy is really claimed through the concept of apostolic succession, which is an interesting doctrine. It's amazing how anybody can claim this doctrine of apostolic succession, which isn't even taught anywhere. But basically, the concept of apostolic succession is this notion, and there's a lot of churches that claim it, not just the Catholic Church. But they claim that an apostle might appoint somebody else that they pass the baton to. And then this person takes on after their death, and they take on, through the passing of that baton, as it were, the actual authority invested in the office, authority given by Almighty God. And of course, in order to be the organization that can't be competed with properly or easily, you have to claim to be the only organization that has the batons. And that was, of course, the claim that was being made. And interesting claim. But this was established also through this concept of apostolic succession. Now, there's some churches that call themselves apostolic churches, and they would not claim that the same kind of thing happened, but something very similar. They would claim that, Paul won certain people to Christ and ordained them to the ministry. And then those people won other people to Christ and ordained them to the ministry. And they rose to leadership, and then they led other people, and then they were ordained to the ministry, and so on and so on and so on. So that in some of these apostolic churches, they would claim our minister is a person who had the laying on of hands from somebody who ordained him. And that person who did that was somebody who, one time before, somebody else laid hands upon them and ordained them. And then somebody ordained those guys. And then somebody ordained those guys all the way back to Peter and Paul and the other apostles that Jesus had originally called. And so these people in their apostolic claim would claim that there's a succession of office, even if it can't be traced from one to the other. Now, to me, this is a strange concept, because where did Jesus ever talk about this? And even if he didn't, but does this make sense to you? That just because somebody has this baton, they have somehow now a divine authority to pass the baton on. And now that they passed that baton on, that person and no one else has this authority? Does that sound like something God would do? Or does that sound like something men would try to persuade you God did, so that when they claim that, well, you see, I happen to have the baton here, this is a way of kind of keeping away all challengers to the authority. I have the baton. We have apostolic authority and apostolic succession. You weren't ordained by an apostle, or you weren't ordained by an apostle's ordinee. You just you're not in that lineage, so you don't get the authority. It's just kind of a crazy thing. But of course, they would also claim that this is part of what gives them legitimacy. Now, many people may know this, but they may not know exactly the details. But up the first 100 years of the church was rather disorganized, and for about 20 years, it was mostly thought of as a Jewish sect. And it wasn't until about 20 years down the road that it became more of a Gentile kind of thing, or that people, even who were Jews, were no longer associated with Judaism, and it kind of split and started going in various directions. And it was undisciplined, and it didn't always speak with just one voice. But it was also something that had become somewhat illegal, and there was a lot of trouble. But in 315, Christianity became legal through Constantine, who legalized it. I think it was 2 years early, that when he had become emperor, he credited Jesus Christ and Christianity with having made it possible for him to become the emperor. And so that's why he legalized it and gave Christianity its rights. Now, it's also well documented in the history of Constantine that when he did that there were a few things that disturbed Constantine. One thing, he wanted to gather as many relics of the apostles as he could, their bones and things they'd owned and touched, so that he could kind of bring this authority to himself. And I think there was even one story about how he was actually going to create a graveyard where all of the 12 original apostles would have been buried there in a circle. And he was preparing, from what I heard, another tomb to be created in the center that was going to be his. But I don't know how true that is. That's an interesting story. Constantine, though, in his history, we find that he is disturbed about a couple of things. First of all, Christianity entertains a lot of various different ideas. He didn't think that was a good idea. And so he thought it would please God if he tended to stabilize it. And if differences were reduced, and we could say, if there's any controversies, people say this and other people say, no, not that, this over here. No, not that, it's this over here. And people couldn't entirely agree. But up until Constantine, these disagreements either just simply existed, or people learned to tolerate them and live with them, but nobody was really trying to eliminate them. It was more of an open discussion in some ways, other than the fact that Christianity was illegal and get you killed. So these discussions did go on. Constantine wanted to bring an end to it. This, in my opinion, was part of the, perhaps unintended, but the evil that helped to bring the church into its current very uh, at times extremely abusive condition, and at other times it's just this big, powerful organization that has accomplished many wonderful things while being organized. You know, with this, Constantine actually then had one of the first councils that was unique. Not the first council ever. Back in 50, the church got together in Jerusalem to try and discuss, what do we do with Gentiles? Do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to? What do we do? And so there was, in a sense, a council there. So the precedent had been set that the various different people who were thought to be leadership material or thought to be people in the know or possessing some sort of credibility or ought to have some sort of authoritative opinion, discuss the issue and come up with a decision as to just what we do with Gentiles. And of course, I'd like to ask them, when was it any of your business what you're going to do with Gentiles? When was it ever the church's business to try to control its people like that? I don't get it, particularly since the message that Jesus brought was one, the kingdom is among you. Even Paul, who seemed to later get the understanding, there's only one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. We're not your mediators. We're not the go-between. We're not the people who get you to God. And yet this was their authority to get together and make these decisions on behalf of other people, which is another way of saying, we don't think you have a brain and we don't want you to use it. So they had these councils, and Constantine continued to do that, and he used the method of council. And one of the first councils that got together was to try to decide the nature of Christ. Did he pre-exist the day he was born, or was that the day he was born? Is he just as much God as the Father, or is he subordinate? And so they got together and decided upon those issues. Now, here again, I'm kind of baffled at the fact that people even think it makes a difference. Now, does it even really matter? That would be just like, I'm a kid who has there's 7 of us siblings in my family. The last thing on the earth I'm going to do is get together with one of my sisters or my brother and start arguing about whether mom was this or that, or whether dad was this or that. Oh, no. He was he was this and that, and then what difference does any of that stuff make? It doesn't change the fact that he is the one who is our father. It doesn't change the fact that our mom is the one who is our mom. It doesn't change the fact that they were born about the time they were born, back in the early 1900s, and that my mom passed away, I guess, somewhere in 89, and my dad passed away just a few years ago. But and they're gone, and they're history. What value is there in arguing about the exact nature of them as people? In relating to them, what information did we have as kids to even know that stuff? And when I look at even what's available in the Bible, I do think that there's a lot of people who teach a lot of wild and weird things by extracting them from the Bible in some weird, obtuse manner. But at the same time, the Bible, I don't see it as a book that was ever intended to be used for teaching us some sort of precise and exact theology. I don't think that it is in there for us to be looking at it so that we can know the exact, precise manner in which Jesus is Jesus and is the Christ and is all. I don't. Now, and none of that. Now that I see that it's not there, I can see that many of us would wonder about that. And of course, as we're thinking about it, there's some things that would make sense to us, and that's just something that would make sense to us. And some things that might make sense to somebody else, and that's just what makes sense to them. So what? Why can't I live with the fact that other people might have a different opinion? And so I don't really see these councils as being at all necessary. Christianity didn't have to be organized around a large body of consistency. In fact, the more it had tolerated certain vague differences of opinion, the more it could have entertained what the possibilities could have been, maintained a slightly more humble approach to the things it was doing, and then find those things upon which they can absolutely agree and center on. And, that's the way it is, like in my family. And it's true, by the way, that I and my siblings each have a slightly different view of who our mom and dad were. And this became particularly real to realize at the time that my dad died and I had to speak at the funeral. And I wanted to say the kinds of things that would be meaningful to all of my sisters and my brother. But that wasn't necessarily an easy thing to figure out how to say, what to do, because there were some things I could have said that would have pleased one and really offended another. So, uh, and the point is, he's gone, he's dead, he was our father, we're burying him, we want to honor him. We don't need to be arguing about whether we have a difference of opinion as to exactly who he was, what he was like, what his problems were or weren't, or what, those things in some ways aren't even the major point. Life goes on. We need to find a way of honoring him, burying him in honor, and then moving on. And so I see some of these councils as trying not to really. Now they say, "Oh, but we need to do this for the faith." No, you don't. You need to do this for your organization so that you can sustain and maintain better and stronger control. Not only that, but when people differ over things about which there's plenty of room to have different opinions, and you can declare one opinion a heresy and another opinion to be the truth. Well, this causes people who are wondering about, well, which truth do I believe in, to realize they can't think for themselves because there isn't really any powerful difference between the opinions in terms of which one's persuasive. So now, rather than using your brain, rather than using persuasion to understand these differences, you have to resort to authority. Well, how convenient for the organization, and how sad for Christianity. Anyway, so these councils became, Arianism was one of the first biggies in the year 300 there. And oddly enough, many people may not realize this, but not only was Arianism declared to be a heresy, the Arians continued anyway. They just continued on their own. And in fact, the church was in many ways still very divisive and very different in its opinions, but people were now starting to cluster around authorities. And there was during the 300s a great deal of competition going on. People who were actually more devoted to an Arianism were actually trying to win more people in Northern Europe that hadn't been yet converted. The barbarians and the so-called Neanderthals that were living up there hadn't been converted to Christianity yet, and we haven't gotten out to Ireland yet, apparently, or to England. And so these two different groups were competing for who's going to get there first. And of course, back in those days, if you could get the king converted or the ruler converted of a particular region, wow, well, that could make your religion the official one. And that is what actually happened. It was the Roman Catholics that actually won over one of the barbarian kings, and he made it the official religion there. And the Arians lost out on that one. We got a viewer comment here. The problem of Constantine is really interesting. I think some people count that moment in history as a victory for God, but Constantine's motivation had nothing to do with the kindness of God. I think the group that calls itself the church suffers to this very day because of Constantine's misguided decisions that revolved around Christianity. I don't know where that comment came from, but I would totally agree with it. Definitely, I see it as his version of power struggle, his attempt to put a divine stamp on his own authority and to try to even continue that. And it was more of a political power play. And this is where the church became extremely political. And so I totally agree with your comment. By the time we get around to Constantine and this, that we end up with having another set of councils that are trying to now decide everything. And these are councils where there's a great deal of arguing over just what the truth is, and with a decision to decide what's going to be considered heresy. And who's out, who we're not going to have fellowship with, and who we're going to condemn, who and what, what teaching and who's teaching it, they're all condemned. By 382, they had councils that had decided what the canon, that is, what books belong in the biblical collection. And by 391, only, a few years after that, we then have the Latin Vulgate becoming the common Bible being used. And the interesting thing about that is that a lot of people don't know this, but by this time, Koine Greek is dead. There's nobody who speaks it. Well, there's plenty who read it and understand a little bit of it, but it's a dead language. Nobody really uses it much anymore, at all, actually, by that time, and nobody understands it. It's kind of an archaic. It's even worse than us trying to read Shakespeare and trying to make real precise sense out of some of the odd little turns of words in the way they would occur, or trying to go back and read Beowulf or something by Chaucer in its original condition. It's very difficult to read, even though it's supposedly an earlier version of English. And so by this time, Koine Greek is dead, which means all the documents that are part of the New Testament are unreadable to not only the masses, but to everybody in the church. That's an historical fact, that the Latin Vulgate was the version they were studying. People like Augustine, although he had access to some of the Greek manuscripts, he really couldn't read it, and he did his studying from the Latin Vulgate. It was there, but this was not just because this was not what I would call a pernicious error necessarily. Back then, linguistics was not that strong of a science, and most people just assumed, well, it's in this language, we've translated it into a different language, we're good to go. There was just this assumption that all languages could be just decoded from one language to another, and they didn't know better. And so it wasn't as if they did that necessarily deliberately. It's just unfortunate that it happened this way, and that's one of the reasons why they let the Koine Greek die. You don't need it. We got the Latin Vulgate, and I can understand it perfectly. So, why trudge through this original document when the Latin says the exact same thing? So that was their attitude. And that continued, by the way, to be their attitude for almost 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, the Koine Greek remained ignored. It was kept and preserved for its historical relic authority, in a sense, but it was not really read or studied until about another 1,000 years. And then they discovered they were having some problems with it, and they reconstructed it. But that's another lesson. I'm not going to talk about that. Then something else that happened. It wasn't until 451, the year 451, when they had another council at Chalcedon, where I don't know if that's the proper pronunciation, Chalcedon, whatever. But anyway, at this council, this is where the Roman papal primacy was declared. Now, to me, it's interesting that they would have to declare it. Supposedly, if Peter was the first pope, then that would have been the declaration right there, and the succession of popes all the way through simply would have been a mere succession. What was it in 451 that caused them to decide that's what had to be? Well, there were actually 5 different areas of the church that were becoming real strong centers. And in some ways, they were each competing for the authority over the other, or over the churches. And so this was in some ways a power play to give primacy to the Roman Church, and so it gave them that final stamp of authority, that where everyone else had become subservient to the Roman, whoever was the pastor there in Rome. Now, also at this time, great missionary activity begins to take on. As they're trying to reach out into the rest of the world. But the conflicts over the papal authority continued even after this decision. And this is part of what caused the Eastern and the Western churches to split, because they said, sorry, we ain't buying it. You're not head over us. That ain't going to happen. And this is one of those little things that sometimes gets just, pushed under the rug. It was really the first Protestant movement in a sense. That was one of the things troubling the church. The other thing that was troubling the church at that time, and one of the reasons why the Roman church was able to come up as prime, is because Islam is starting to make its movement. It's starting to make its motions through that area of the world, and it couldn't quite get its way through Europe. And not only that, but Christianity and Islam are already bumping heads in violent ways. And as it would soon happen, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and then later Antioch would fall to the Islamic influences and no longer be Christian centers at all. And so in some ways, there's a lot of power struggle going on in the church at that time, trying to make it happen, trying to maintain that. The Ottoman Empire became mostly Muslim, and they basically took things over, and the Ottoman Empire remained really in control until like about the 1500s, and some of those areas of the globe then actually became part of the British Empire. Strange history. But anyhow, this was the kind of conflict that the church was going through until finally around the year 16, in the 16th century. That's when we have the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, which are both badly named, by the way. The Reformation wasn't really a reformation. They didn't reform it. They quit. They left. They didn't change anything. They just changed their own minds and went on in a new direction. And the Counter-Reformation wasn't really a counter to the Reformation. It was an actual Reformation. The Catholic Church, after this great split with the Protestants, it did start to change its ways and clean up a couple of its ideas and its notions, and tried to codify. And in some ways, it tried to clean up some of its problems so that it could sustain the problem, but in a much cleaner version. Indulgences and things like that remained in place. Icons and things like this remained in place, but with a far more thought out, worshipful, as it were, more respectable, as it were, way of understanding it. This is strange when you stop to think about it, how all this thing is going on. But I think that this helps us to see, when we look at some of this history, I think this is part of what helps us to see how all of these things are happening in a manner that indicates just how man-made this organization is. Now, I have nothing against man-made organizations so long as they know they're man-made. And I don't see how Christianity could have ever survived throughout the ages without us establishing various different organizations for various different purposes. But I remember, when I was up in Utica, and I was up there working with the church, and that I met some people who were with Campus Crusade for Christ and a few other things. And this is the first time that I heard them use a great deal this term, parachurch ministries. They're ministries that are not run by a church. They're Christian organizations, but they're not churches. And this made a distinction because many of these parachurch organizations had to declare themselves to be parachurch so that churches wouldn't have to tell them, no, we won't let you in here because you're not supposed to be a church. We are. And there were many Baptist churches, even some Christian Missionary Alliance churches and various other churches that were evangelical or fundamentalist that considered these organizations to be absolutely wrong because they weren't run by churches. Well, you know what? All churches are parachurch organizations. Not a single one of them is a real church. And you will never find a real church. You don't need to find a real church. There's no such thing materially as a real church. And we don't need a real church. And anybody claiming to be a real church isn't. That's just the way that it is. The church is made up of those people. It's kind of like, who's the head of the human race? We're a bunch of organisms that share the same species, and we're just a species. We just live. We're alive. Now we certainly need to organize our efforts, but we don't have like the President of the United States. He's the head of all human beings. No, he's not. He's the President of the United States. He's got a jurisdiction that he's limited to, and things like that. And we have to pay attention to that kind of thing when it comes to the issues of the church. The church is an organism. It is a group of people who believe in Christ. I teach people that there's a universal church, and that's everybody who believes, and there's a local church, and that's everybody who lives in my area and who embraces Jesus. If the people who live next door to me believe in Jesus, they're part of the church. What if they go to that real super fundamentalist church? Man, they're still part of my church. What if they go down to that real liberal place down there that doesn't even know what they think, or it doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is people who are in Christ. That is the church, and it's made up of people. It's not made up of people who agree. It's made up of people, and that's it. And that's the only church there ever is. And that's not an easy thing to manage. And it does require sometimes getting a little bit organized, which is helpful to do. But that organization is simply what we are doing as an organization, is what we're doing as people. And I think it's important. Well, on this day that we finally come up with a new pope, this is at least the way that I see it, the way that I put it into gear. I like the idea that we do have some organizations. I'm not bothered by the fact that we have organizations. I participate with many organizations. I'm not even necessarily even bothered by the fact that we have congregations that meet together and do this on a regular basis. But it does bother me the moment they want to say that what we're doing is something God has called us to do, something we are doing not only with divine calling and divine permission, but with divine authority. And somehow this behooves others to step in line with God and fall in line with them. That's when it's getting coercive. That's when it's wrong. That's when it's not really of God at all. And it's a shame, but the Christian movement has really pretty much come down to that in a very huge way. And thankfully, there are many people bringing that to a crashing end and breaking free and still being connected as they can with other people who are also people of faith, but without necessarily doing it in a way where we think that we're somehow now part of a divine organization. You don't need a divine organization. There are plenty of things to think about, and we can't always agree on them, and we don't need to. We can continue to discuss them openly. We can pursue honesty, and there's a lot of things we'll never figure out, and we don't need to. Did my dad hate hangnails, or did he enjoy them? I don't know, and I don't care. It just doesn't. We're each facing our lives where we're at. The questions of love, the questions of who am I? Am I valuable? Am I valuable to God? Am I valuable to me? Are other people valuable to me? Are they valuable to God? How am I treating my neighbor? What's the impact of my life on them? These are far more important questions than, let's see, was Jesus divine in exactly the same way? Or is there a sense in which he was even at odds? Was Jesus actually separated from the Father on the cross? And these are stupid questions. They really are. They're somebody told me that, Bob, you're a professor, you shouldn't say that. And they said, Bob, I'll tell you what, you got to tell your students, there's no such thing as a stupid question. There's just stupid students. I said, oh, come on, you ruined it. But the truth is, those are useless questions. They aren't worth even thinking about. I mean, if you have an opinion, wonderful, have it. If somebody else has a different opinion, wonderful, let them have it. It doesn't make a difference on a lot of those things. There's no need for us to conform. Our unity is in the person we have faith in, not in what it is we believe about that person. Well, anyway, that's my little diatribe about organized church and taking a look at early church history as a way of trying to bring that into focus. Hope you got something out of it. Thanks for the few comments. I'm Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor, and I'll see you again on Sunday. Take care.